what we were trying to do in thinking about, in Nous Group, in thinking about how to fix the federation, as it were, was to start with looking at the notion that gets bandied about a fair bit, that the one way to sort of solve the problem of overlap and duplication is really just to arrive at some kind of grand bargain where, for example, the Commonwealth assumes all responsibility for health, and then the states, on the other hand, assumed all responsibility for schools. And there's a couple of reasons why that sort of thinking, in our view, we felt wasn't going to be particularly fruitful. There's a lot of reasons why, these aren't new ideas, there's a lot of reasons why these sorts of ideas of a grand bargain haven't had success in the past, and they're partly to do with things like the globalisation trend and the extent to which issues are necessarily becoming much more interrelated and much more national in their scope. But it's also the sheer realpolitik of governments feeling a need to respond to communities' desire for them just to do something, to intervene, to respond, to take action. And that's a very pervasive driver that compels governments at either tier to get involved, to embark on some new initiative. So for those reasons and others, we thought that we need to think of a different way of how to deal with this issue of overlap and duplication. And our first point was to look at the concept of roles and responsibilities and ask ourselves, what really are we talking about here? They're often bundled together. We talk about, the differing roles and responsibilities of the different layers of government. But one way to think about this is that responsibilities really refer to the portfolio areas that are in contention. So, for example, health or education. And roles are the different functions that governments can play. So that can be a policy-making role, a regulatory role, or oversight role, or it can be a service delivery role. And so the paper talks about how if you think in terms of which role should be performed within a particular responsibility area by which layer of government, then you start to get to a way of thinking about reducing overlap that doesn't have the same sort of weaknesses that a big grand bargain might deliver. So what does this mean in practical terms? So to take the example of schooling, rather than say, one layer of government does schools in exchange for the other layer of government doing something else, you say, well, what roles are we most concerned about in school education? And I'm picking schooling because I can see a few education people here in the room who know a lot more about this than I do, I'm sure. But we would say, okay, which layer of government should do the service delivery bit? Which layer of government should do the regulatory oversight bit and ensuring, overall quality, say, of the workforce or the curriculum? And then which layer of government should be most directly involved in the policy making that's guiding both the regulatory and service delivery components? Once you start to break it down that way, then it's a little bit easier. It's still hard, but it's a little bit easier to come to some sensible conclusions about where those functions should be performed. For argument's sake, continuing the analogy of the example of schools, we might say that states are better equipped to take charge of all service delivery aspects. That regulation might also be state-based, but you might want it to be nationally consistent. Therefore, you can have the states all get around a table and agree what national consistency looks like. You don't necessarily need the Commonwealth at the table. This is another important point. Having things done in a nationally consistent way doesn't mean that the Commonwealth has to do it. There are mechanisms for states and territories to coordinate to still produce the same result. And so you might have state-based regulation, but it's harmonised, it's aligned. But then you might have a shared policy responsibility. So recognising that education has ramifications for Australia's international competitiveness, for example, then you might agree, well, there's a particular role for the Commonwealth in the policy space. And so you still end up with a shared role in some cases, and that still needs to be carefully defined and managed, but it gives you a little bit more granularity and a little bit more to work with in a tangible way, rather than think in terms of a big bucket called schooling and a big bucket called health or environment or what else, whatever other portfolios are in contention. So that's the broad concept that's laid out in the article. We also think about how do you make those judgments, and there's reference being made to the principle of subsidiarity. One of the arguments we put forward is that there's a problem with the subsidiarity principle. It usually leads you to a sort of trade-off between national interests versus kind of local considerations and localised innovation and delivery. And that's often a tough judgment call. And one of the reasons it's a tough judgment call is that when you think about subsidiarity, you're sometimes thinking about efficiency, or you're sometimes thinking about effectiveness. It conflates some different concepts. You know, it really comes down to what feels right that should be done at a more local level. So rather than use the concept of subsidiarity, the paper argues that it's better to think in terms of what's going to be most efficiently done at a particular level, what's going to be most effectively done at a particular level, and to have those two considerations be worked through separately to give you a richer sense of, so what does this look like? In many cases, you still have to make an on-balance judgment, but it does throw up different lines of questions that give you different answers and give you a richer sense of the pros and cons of roles being handled at one layer versus another layer. So that's the broad set of arguments in my paper. I might just leave it there and give others a chance to talk about their papers, but would just note briefly that a lot of these ideas I think are consistent with some of the things that Dr. Watt was saying about you can have different modes of delivery these days, so you might still have a market-based system or an insurance-based system for service delivery like the NDIS, but you still might want to think in terms of so I have sort of distributed or different service delivery. You still might want to have a shared policy role or a shared regulatory role. So this sort of framework doesn't contradict the arguments being put forward about how service delivery is changing, and therefore that throws up a different way of thinking about the Federation. I think that's quite complementary. But I'll just leave it there for now. Thanks very much.